Evening, everybody. We are officially live, and this is pretty exciting. I get to do this with my my wonderful, loving wife here. I hope she's loving. And yeah, we don't get to actually teach that often together, especially not online like this. So it's kind of fun to actually be like right next to each other in the same room and share tonight a topic that we're both incredibly passionate about, and a really great time of year to actually dive into this topic. Getting into the world of wild foraging for food, for medicine, and just a different way of relating to the land, which to me feels so relevant in these times, whether it's we're feeling kind of the overwhelm from just all the busyness that a lot of us feel in the world right now, or it's feeling like we have too much tech in our lives, or it's that we're thinking about food security right now, with rising food prices and, some concerns that people have around even the capacity of our medical systems. I think coming back into relationship with our food, coming back into relationship with plants, really makes a lot of sense right now on so many different levels. It soothes the soul, but there's also a real practical side to it as well. So I'm really excited to dive into that. I'm just going to share a few kind of opening words, but then it's mostly going to be Laura sharing tonight. So I'm going to pass it over to her in a little moment here, but I just wanted to do a little bit of an opening as we kind of bring us all together. And maybe I'll just start us off tonight with a little bit of gratitude. And if you are open to it and you wanted to share in the chat, if you just tuned in, where you're coming from tonight, and maybe something you're feeling grateful for tonight. And I had a really, really beautiful week this week. I was actually just up in North Bay, and I'm doing some work with the Anishinaabe Education Institute, who are a support body for the Anishinaabe peoples of these lands. And it's a real honor to get to go up and spend time working in their communities. And this year I was actually invited to attend their spring medicine camp. And one of the elders, yesterday I got to sit, and she did this beautiful teaching of the 13 Anishinaabe moons. So I just kind of wanted to bring that into our awareness right now, in that, we're in, according to the Anishinaabe people, the sugar moon, or at least the Anishinaabe peoples of these regions. And the elder Glenna, who was sharing yesterday, I can't remember her last name. I feel a little bad for that. I think Bokesh, I think it is. Glenna Bokesh, I believe is her name, from up in Nipissing First Nation. But she was speaking to the sugar moon right now, and it being such a significant time of the year. And then she kind of walked us through the 13 moons. And those aren't my teachings to share, but I weave them in right now just to honor those deep teachings of the land and the people that have hold that wisdom from all cultures, that remind us of that seasonal calendar that all of our ancestors, wherever we came from, lived by at one time. And I know I've been really digging into my ancient Scottish and Hungarian and English lineage the last little bit. And there's old Celtic calendars that also follow the moons and the seasons and the food calendars. And I've been digging in and kind of researching into some of those pieces. So my gratitude tonight is, I guess, the people that kind of hold that old knowledge that connects us back to the land in a more relational way, in a really deep way. And thankful for the caretakers that are still here on this land, that are holding that wisdom, but also caretaking the land itself. I'm super aware of how many ecosystems in the world today are severely changed and even damaged, and have lost a lot of biodiversity. And I'm thankful in this part of North America that, we live in pretty healthy, intact forest. And a lot of that has to do with, the caretakers of the land and people like the Anishinaabe Nation, and the many indigenous nations that have been holding on to that, and modern people that have, come over here as settlers and kept up that caretaking spirit. So, I'll extend a little bit of gratitude for that tonight. It's directly relevant to what we're talking around with the plants. Maybe I'll pass it over if you want to share anything or share some gratitude, and then we'll dive into the first question.
Yeah, I'm feeling really grateful. It's still there, even though we just had spring equinox, it still is winter here. Again, one thing I really love about March is that from the surface, it still feels like winter. We still have loads of snow on the ground. I'm seeing some of the places that people are messaging where they're tuning in from tonight, and many of you actually are in full on spring, but we still have like a good solid almost 2 feet of snow on the ground, but you can feel the energy rising. And especially literally tapping into the energy of the maple trees right now. I'll share more. I've been drinking lots of maple sap, and it's been such a gift to enjoy that spring tonic at a time of year that still feels very much like winter.
Yeah, awesome. So just so folks know kind of the game plan for tonight. So this is going to be, maybe about an hour,
Mhm.
hour and 15 minutes, somewhere in that neighborhood. And really an introduction to foraging. I know some people here probably have done some foraging before, maybe
Mhm.
done some foraging walk. Maybe there's a couple of plants you're comfortable with. And what does that journey look like to go from knowing a little bit of plants to them actually being an integrated part of your life and a real ally in this changing world in a real practical way?
Mhm.
And Laura, is something that I think the two of us are really feel like it's been a real gift in our lives is to actually be at a place where we eat food from the land almost every day of the year,
Mhm.
all through the winter, between the stuff in our garden, between, I go out on the land and I'm fishing and doing things like that. And then all of the foraging. I mean, we eat wild forage food, right through the winter,
Mhm.
throughout the year.
Yeah.
So it's a real gift to get to that place, but that's been a journey, a 25-year long journey for us to get to that point where it's such an integrated part of our life and we make a lot of our own medicine. So hopefully tonight we're going to kind of share some of the things that kind of helped us getting from, just looking at field guides and starting to ID plants and being comfortable with a few things
Mhm.
to actually setting up systems and seasonal cycles and, kind of having our own calendar that we work from as far as how we work with the land throughout the year when it comes to food, when it comes to medicine.
Mhm.
So that's where we're going to go tonight. It'll be about an hour long.
Mhm.
So to start off, I was going to ask, what are the seasonal cycles that you're particularly feeling connected to right now when it comes to food? What does this season bring up for you?
Yeah, so this for me very much feels like the new year. In January when we have like Gregorian calendar New Year, it doesn't really align, but right at the spring equinox feels like the beginning of the new year because it's when the new energy starts to come. So, in terms of like the foraging cycle, the um what's I'm most connected to right now is the maple tree. Like I think especially for folks of us in Canada, it's so ingrained in Canadian culture that we take it for granted how important um and even the fact like that people forget that it's a foraged food. People are like interested in foraging and forget that like one of the most important foraging that you can do in the North Woods is harvest maple sap. Many people have had maple syrup, and that's the process of boiling down that maple sap that you collect. You can collect it from multiple maple trees. You can also do from other trees as well, like walnut and birch. But the season that we have the longest is the maple trees, and it has the best sugar ratio. So you have to have 40, say, liters of um, 40 liters of maple sap to make 1 liter of syrup. And so that's the process of boiling it down. And it can be as complicated or as simple as you want. But right now, one of the things that I'm actually just mainly doing with the sap is drinking it. And I think it's one of the most underrated early spring foraging that you can do. Drinking, and the thing like I've been doing it for years. When I first started collecting maple sap, and people would talk about like sipping from the maple buckets, and sometimes people, as they're boiling, would pull a cup out. But I've never really seen people like drinking it like a tonic. And then I started to see this trend of like companies selling it like sparkling water, and you can actually buy like there's a few companies that make maple sap. But the last number of years, the thing that I've really noticed in myself is that I start to crave it. So I'm not someone who is the best at staying hydrated. Um, I'm often being poked, being asked if I've drank water. Um, and then through the winter, I'm more like I don't drink a lot of like water. I'm drinking like teas and trying to stay hydrated that way. But a few weeks ago, I caught myself starting to get like really, really thirsty. And it was funny. I had this day where I like was making teas and then I was cooling. Like I was so thirsty for something cold, which is again in the winter I don't drink a lot of cold stuff. So I was like, "Oh, that's funny that I'm craving like a cold drink." And so I was making teas and chilling them and then got like coconut water and like different things and like nothing was like satisfying what I wanted. And then I realized it was the beginning of this maple sap season. Like I looked at the weather and was like, it's gonna be above zero. And then like ran out and like got some of my maple buckets and just put up 2 buckets just so I could start collecting sap. And then when I collected that sap and drank that cold maple sap, the feeling of satiation, like it was like this was what I was craving. This is exactly what my body is looking for at this time of year. And, we all know maple syrup as being something like sweet and tasty, but the minerals coming up from the earth, that beautiful complex of like nutrients that come from maple sap, just feel like this really simple but like really important plant to like, tonic to be drinking at this time of year. And it's, yeah, right now it's like the most important thing in foraging.
Yeah. Maybe I'll just share a couple other things on maple. Actually, something that I think is almost magical when you really start tracking the seasonal food cycles and you put it into like an ancient context of, older civilizations, pre-modern world, and then put it even into our modern context, it still applies. It's almost like nature knows what nutrients we need at each time of the year for the humans and for the animals. And interesting enough, we've just had this long, cold winter up here. Where using a more traditional diet, you're eating a lot of meats, you're eating a lot of dry foods. And by this time of year, the diet starts to get lean and nutrient density goes down. And then all of a sudden, the spring maples start to run and you get this incredibly mineral rich sap coming up here. And then you get those first green succulents that start to pop out of the ground that are, again, just some of those, as far as like all the phytonutrients and the micronutrients are just full of them. So it's kind of neat that, that's how the spring starts off. But then the fall basically ends with all the fatty things. That's when all of the nuts, the acorns and the walnuts and the hazelnuts, that's when a lot of the traditional hunting seasons are, where you go out and actually harvest meat for the wintertime. And it's interesting that we get all of this intense protein and fat right before the cold season to allow us to fatten up for the winter months. And then in the spring, we actually get these very light foods coming up and actually, bringing it back to our bodies. It makes me think actually about, the black bears that are have had their babies just recently. I don't know if you know that, but it's usually in February that the black bears lay their babies, but they're still in their den, and they're still, kind of half asleep. But here are these little babies that are out there. And then they come out on those early spring days when the snow is just starting to melt. And then those very first spring greens, the skunk cabbage and the wild leeks that come up and the black bears start feeding on those, the perfect nutrients that they need. The mama bear and those young cubs when they're coming up. So I just thought I'd kind of speak to that for a second. It's just how beautiful, when you tune into these cycles and you realize the actual nutrient quality that's coming out with the different seasons. There's something almost magical about that. And at the same time, of course it's like that. I mean, this is what we've evolved with for 100,000 years, Two other things I'll just share on the maple really quick. And then maybe do we go into the seasonal cycle slide yet? We've been exploring the last couple of years with actually making teas with maple sap as well. A lot of people just think about maple syrup. And I will say that we tap the red maple and the silver maple and the sugar maple all the same. A lot of people think you can only do it with sugar maple, and we tap all three and love drinking all three and also make maple syrup from all three. But recently we've been actually brewing teas in the maple sap. And another winter thing that we forage is the chaga mushroom. So doing chaga tea in maple sap, you want to talk about like potent medicine.
So good.
Yeah. And then the other day, last week, we did white pine tea. And again, the evergreen needles are a great thing to be harvesting in the wintertime too, when there's not a lot of...
Yeah, we'll touch on it.
Yeah, we'll touch on that lately. But, literally making tea with the sap with the evergreen needles is just a beautiful, beautiful treat in nutrient density there. But yeah, do you want me just to pull out that slide and do you want to dig in? Does that make sense? Great. So give me a second here. We're going to go with this one right here. And I'll just go full screen. Oh, hold on. I can't admit people when I'm full screen. It's kind of funny that way.
So to start off, often when a lot of people are interested in talking about foraging or you're learning about foraging, you get like this, say, field guide, and it's just like full of lists of plants. What are all these different plants? And it can almost be overwhelming. We're talking about like hundreds of species that you can potentially use for food and medicine that grow just in my bioregion here in central Ontario. And that can be really overwhelming. And it also can be just like a lot of time people are really interested in foraging, but they will miss the windows for things. They'll miss the actual time frames to actually successfully harvest them. And so...
sorry. Yeah, it's being funny right now.
So we can just put that on in a minute,
Yeah.
guys. Yeah.
Okay, we'll just talk for a second.
So the concept that I really like to make sure people really understand is that almost like being prepared for the season that you're coming into. So instead of like approaching nature and being like, oh, I'm gonna go foraging, and like, let's say you're like, I'm gonna go foraging today, and just like grabbing an empty basket, heading to the woods, and being like, what's, expecting to kind of go be like going out in the grocery store. I really want to talk tonight about what are some like mindsets and some tools and practices, things that you can get into place so that instead of looking at it as like, I'm just going to go out and see what I find, it's more around like, it's spring. This is the ecosystem I'm in. This is the area I'm familiar with. What should I expect? Like, I almost never go out into the woods just like blind. I mean, mushrooms, you're always kind of like a little bit exploring. But most of the time when I'm going out foraging, I have like a very clear intention of what I'm going for. It's about, you know, I was really introduced to foraging, I think, first through permaculture. So permaculture was something that I was studying in my like late teens, early 20s, and it was this concept around, it was a design methodology around sustainable living. And permaculture has this set of principles for being in relationship with the land, so that you can like more sustainably grow your own food. And the first permaculture principle is observation. And that very first principle's observation is around like, if I'm going to be in relationship with the land and wanting to be in like good relationship with land, harvesting and growing my own food, first things first is like, what is nature already providing? What is the land that I'm on, rooted in, already providing? And when we first bought our homestead, our like little permaculture farm that we run, we intentionally we like moved in the summer. We intentionally didn't do anything on the land for like almost the first year, because it was really important to us to first and foremost really get to know the species that were already on the land, watch how the water flowed, watch how the light moved across the land, got to know, patterns. And so some of the things I was really aware of in that first year was what plants are already growing here and what were the particular time frames that they were kind of like at their best for harvesting. And it was really tuning in to like, first and foremost, who is here? Who's already on this land? And what are the perfect times for kind of like working with them? And then especially, it can go to like, there's these incredible native plants, that we can work with. But then from a responsibility perspective, I also was really aware of like, what weeds, what invasive species are growing on my property that have, medicinal or culinary value that I can actually help care for this land by harvesting them. And so, it's like that first question of like, in the areas that you go, it's like, who, instead of just like, what can I eat from here? It's like, who's here and what responsibilities do I have to this land and to the species that are here? And then knowing which season, the different seasons. So we'll talk about some of the different foraging seasons, the parts of the plants we'd harvest at those seasons. So we are on the kind of top right there, spring. So not quite there yet. We're in the sap season. This is when the energy kind of starts to come up from the land. Now, some of you that are, maybe even very Southern Ontario, or especially those of you folks like in the States, spring is quite possibly full on. I definitely have seen photos online of people down in the States already harvesting ramps or wild leeks. But when that early spring energy is rising up, once the snow melts, once the frost is out of the ground, you get the early shoots and the early greens. That's like kind of like the salad garden of the season, is those early green shoots. It's still time where you can harvest roots. So things like the dandelion roots, here we harvest sarsaparilla, burdock roots, Jerusalem artichokes. Those are all plants that you want to be, if you want to harvest the roots of those plants, you want to harvest them when the plants haven't really fully broke their full dormancy. For me, with the dandelions, it's like one of those early, you can think about those early spring flowers. But if I'm going to harvest the roots of the dandelion, I really try to get them before they start to bloom. because that's when the life force and energy and the like full range of like nutrition and constituents are still in the root. As soon as the plant starts to really grow, that energy is going to move up into the plants, into the other parts. So roots are, we harvest them in the fall as well, but like that as soon as the ground is thawed, you can harvest roots, again, the early spring shoots. You know, there's so many plants that, you know, you might read in field guides or in little like foraging guides that talk about eating the leaves of plants, and saying, oh, you can make salad from this. But a lot of the time what we're talking about the young leaves. So something like, again, the dandelion is like, that dandelion leaf might technically be growing. You could technically pick that leaf in August, but by August, by later in the growing season, it's going to be quite tough and bitter. Where early in the spring, when they're fresh and they're tender, that's when we want to really be harvesting the leaves. Gardeners kind of can relate to this when I talk about like, if you plant your lettuce and we want to harvest our lettuce before it bolts, before it really starts to like shoot up. As soon as the it starts to shoot up, you know, it'll get quite bitter. Sap. So if you're harvesting sap, it's really cool actually. If you're harvesting maple sap, like the different trees have different saps. The different trees actually have their sap flowing at different times. So right now in our region, the maple sap is running. But as soon as the snow melts, that's actually when the birch sap starts to run. So the different trees will have but generally the sap, you only want to harvest it before the leaves fully open up. That's really important. As soon as like the buds of those trees start to break, then we stop harvesting the sap. And then bark is a little bit related to there too. There's a number, not as much for food. Obviously, there are barks that you can eat. I consider barks definitely more like survival food as opposed to like something delicious and that I'm gonna make like a fancy culinary meal out of. But there's a number of medicinal barks, and we use things like cramp bark, and there's like different reddish bark. Like there's number of plants that you can harvest the bark for medicine, and the spring is a good time to harvest that because again, when that life force is flowing through, that sap is moving up and down the tree, that's when we want to be harvesting the barks, because that's when that life force, and it's like the most potent time for those medicines is the spring. And for me, spring is like, there's so many tender greens at that time of year. It's like, that's when, if I'm really making like a lot of like pestos and salads and like wanting to capture those greens and then find ways to preserve them and use them, because something like a plant that I harvest that has like a really narrow window in the spring is something called goutweed. So wild leeks, we work with lots of wild leeks, but we'll use goutweed for this example. And goutweed has this like, it's a weed. It's actually quite an invasive plant. So it's one that I've been like working on learning how to like eat more of it. And it's like one of these plants, like it's so abundant that like you could harvest all of the goutweed in your yard, and then the next week, like more of it would come up. But it's only tasty if you kind of harvest it in like the first kind of like 2-3 weeks that the leaves like open. Otherwise it gets really bitter. But it's actually in the same plant family as like parsley. So you want to make sure you get your identification really clear on it, because it's in that parsley carrot family. But goutweed can be like this really good abundant green, but a short window for it. So in the spring, goutweed and a number of other species, things that I'll do is I'll harvest them en masse, blanch and like freeze them, so that I can then like use those like greens in like dishes like spanakoppitas and, you know, curries and soups and stews. And something else that I do, this is actually a spring greens. It's a bag of spring. So the last bag, I should probably start eating them up really soon. This little cube, it's a little frozen cube. that is a number of my spring greens. So it's got some goutweed and some wild leeks and dandelion leaves and some chickweed. And I pureed them up in a food processor with just a little bit of oil and froze them. And then I can pull these out and I can use them in all different kinds of dishes, or make even like chimichurri kind of like sauces with them. And so when I think about spring, I think about wanting to just like preserve the like those early greens and to try to get them to use them throughout the rest of the season, because those delicious abundant greens are not going to be the plants will be available, but they're not going to be tender and tasty as the season goes on.
It also makes it really easy to integrate them into your actual meals, right? Because you don't have to make a big deal out of like, oh, I'm doing this big wild foods meal. Like if you have, you do a big batch of, like we literally do these in ice cube trays, with those spring greens and freeze them. And then all winter long, it's like, oh, we want to make a pasta tonight. You just pull this out and you grab a couple out and throw it in the pasta. Laura mentioned like a chimichurri, like a curry, like eggs even.
Yeah.
But literally it's just grabbing an ice cube, throwing it in with what you're doing. And suddenly you're integrating wild foods, but it's literally taking minutes. It's not like this big planned thing.
Yeah.
And you want to compare the nutrient density of one of these cubes to almost any vegetable that you're getting in the grocery store.
Yeah.
Like, we haven't done the scientific testing on it and sent it off to a lab, but I guarantee you the micronutrient profile of this is night and day difference than what you're going to be getting from typical lettuce that you buy from a grocery store.
Yeah.
So do you want to go back to the side? It's just been the only funny thing is I can't go full screen and then I can't let people in. So we have to keep it on the smaller screen.
Well, we can show it. We'll just to show next one that we're at. So summer. So as we kind of head into summer, and here in our region, that's basically when the nights are kind of like no longer cool. So into June, once all of the leaves are like fully open, the very last thing, the thing that'll happen kind of like the very beginning of summer, and that's when I always think about like when the bugs come out, is like that's when we get like just the spruce tips, might be like just the last thing we get at the very beginning of the summer. But this is flower season. So this is when I am eating a lot of like the nice spring flowers, but then we're also harvesting things like the rose petals and doing infusions with them, like in sugars and honeys. It's when I feel like for me, for like the core part of summer is a lot of like the medicine harvesting. There are some of the later green, something like nettle is something you can sometimes get into a little bit into the summertime, as long as you're harvesting it before they kind of put their flowers out. So every plant has a little bit of a different cycle. And then some plants that you've done a cut of in the spring, you might actually be able to get a second cut of them in the summer. But it's primarily the season for harvesting flowers and harvesting like our medicinal plants. And then that's when after we kind of get through the spring foraging, I put this focus into our, say, vegetable garden. And then what's so interesting, it's like all of the spring greens are done, but that like early summer is your prime time now that's when I'm now shifting to the vegetable garden to get like the greens and my salad goods. That's actually, we create almost like a fake spring. So when you till your gardens, we don't use like a rototiller or anything. We just hand till. Our beds are kind of considered no-till, but you disturb the surface. So you disturb the soil surface, you plant your plants, and then I might not be foraging as much out in the forest because the forest is now kind of going into its like medicine season, but my vegetable garden, because those areas that have been disturbed and now are just kind of greening up, it's like they're having their spring. And that's when all of the weeds are at their peak. So any vegetable gardener knows that kind of like late June, July is like really intensive work for weeding. And one of the things I like love is teaching people the weeds in their garden and how like nutritionally valuable are. So everything from like the purslane and the lamb's quarters and the wood sorrel and like all these things that we're already having to kind of pull from our vegetable beds because we want to have like productive gardens, but really like then making use of those. So that is like my July salad. It's like early spring salads look very different. My July salads are like go to the garden, do some weeding and tending, and then making those salads, and then getting into making the harvesting for teas for all through the winter, harvesting medicines for tinctures, getting medicinal plants into jars, and alcohol so that we have those medicines put away for the winter.
Yeah, I'll just highlight that it's neat, you know, if you actually want to get, again, serious about doing this in any kind of like abundance and quantity and it being a regular part of your life, it's also neat to think about like energetically, just like what you're focusing your energy on the different times of the year, and literally like how much time do I have? Because you only have so much time to put into working the land, foraging, processing, whatever, you know? So it's kind of neat in the spring that it's a lot of just like picking things fresh and eating them. And interesting, like Laura said, in the spring, our garden is not producing much food yet. You know, the asparagus comes up pretty early. Our shiitake mushroom logs come out early. But outside of that, you know, it's usually kind of quite a bit later before we're getting those spring greens. So it's like, oh, we're getting our spring greens from the land while we're planting the garden. And then when the spring greens from the land are done, we can start eating from the garden. But that's when we start processing the medicines. And now we're harvesting our food from the garden while picking the flowers and the aerial parts to make the medicines. So it kind of allows you to kind of chunk and focus in like little blocks to achieve your various needs throughout the season. It's just, I definitely know when I first got into this stuff, I wasn't thinking kind of like cyclically like that or seasonally like that. And it really has made a big difference. So yeah, I just kind of wanted to highlight that. Oh, that's a fun one.
This is a fun one. So
Yeah, I'm gonna go
this
full screen for a second so people can see it.
right here. So some of you have maybe played with these before. So what's really fun about this, these are the immature seed pods of the milkweed plant. So I really love working with milkweed. Milkweed is like probably one of the most important summer harvesting plants that I work with. So as a forager, I consider milkweed one of my like top 3 plants that I work with, because almost every part of milkweed is edible at some point or useful at some point. And so it has like shoots that you can eat in the early spring. The unopened flower bud. So, you know, we've talked about like eating flowers, but it's so cool. When I first started learning about the unopened flower buds of milkweed, I realized I was harvesting them and I realized, oh, this is what broccoli is. If you've never really realized that broccoli is an unopened flower bud, because if you've ever grown broccoli and you don't harvest it, what happens is it like shoots up and opens. So the unopened flower buds of milkweed are amazing, and there's something you can like harvest, blanch, like you, and I'll describe. Every part has to be prepared, but like I'll give them the blanch, and then I freeze them, and then I can have these like bags of these little milkweed flower buds, and it's like having a bag of broccoli in the freezer. And then all the dishes where you'd be like, what do you use frozen broccoli for? I can like use that. And then these are the little seed pod that forms. You can harvest them up to about 1 inch in size. They get boiled first. So you have to, all parts of milkweed you have to like blanch for 30 seconds in hot and boiling water to like take out that milky sap. And then we put them in like a standard garlic pickle brine and pickle them. And they're super fun. And so milkweed is something that I love talking about from a foraging perspective, because it's such a beautiful example of a plant that is abundant. It's called milkweed. It's very weedy. If you get milkweed established on your property, it does not behave. It will like run, because it sends these incredibly deep roots, and then the roots run under the soil and will send up hundreds of little shoots. And so I let like milkweed start to grow in my vegetable garden. I was like, it's so good. I love milkweed, and it's so good for the butterflies. It's like amazing. I love it. But then you hit a point where you're like, oh no, what have I done? So then harvesting it makes sense. But what we do, because we're also trying to support monarchs and create, like, because we live in like dense forest, we don't actually have like a ton of really good habitat for monarch butterflies. We have some swamp milkweed in the wetlands and stuff, but we wanted to create like a nice little pocket for pollinators. So then what's really important is, as a forager, I need to really understand the life cycle of the monarchs. And so when the milkweed are growing, and I will harvest the young shoots first thing in the spring, but once I see the first monarch butterfly, then we stop harvesting shoots, because at that point we want to make sure that the plants that are growing are left kind of like the leaves are not disturbed, because at any point once the adult monarchs start to show up in our garden, it means they could be laying eggs. And so the monarchs come and they lay their eggs on the leaves. So then the parts of the milkweed, whether it's the flower buds or the pods, are not typically where the monarchs are laying their eggs. So we can like leave the plant parts undisturbed. And we can, when we go to harvest the flower buds, you know, I'm always just really conscious that we like check them before we pick them to make sure that there's no little caterpillars hiding. Same with the milkweed pods. Like when, you know, we pick them, we just make sure if you see a caterpillar, you just move on, you go to a different plant. And then we can like harvest those parts. The monarchs can like still complete their life cycles. And then we can still continue to like get food, but it's like that responsibility of harvesting that plant means also having the responsibility of understanding the life cycle of the other species who rely on it. Yeah, so it's probably one of my favorite summer plants to harvest.
Yeah. So, anyways, just to finish that thought off, there is just this idea that, you know, humans have been in relationship with plants for hundreds of thousands of years. And there's many, many examples worldwide of people actually foraging in a way where, you know, we get food and the butterflies still have their habitat as well. And I would argue that if we approach foraging from that perspective of actually observing first and truly trying to understand all of our relations and the different relationships between people, plants, fungi, all those different things, then we can actually figure out how we do that in a symbiotic way where there's food. And if you think about it, you know, if I clear a piece of forest to grow carrots, you know, I get an abundance of food from that carrots, but nothing else is really eating from that area of plot of land. Like it's really just providing me. When I forage, I'm actually sharing that land with all the other species, all the other relations. So, you know, there's a big learning curve there, and it's a different way of looking at the world. But I think it's one worth exploring. And it's one of the really beautiful things that, you know, when we get into foraging, it brings us back into this different type of relationship with the land. And that's a big part of, you know, how we approach this and how we've been mentored, you know?
Yeah, that and learning to find the right balance with all the weeds in your garden. Because I know that my dad, who grew up as an old school tilled land, Miracle Grow, you know, a weed killer against all the dandelions, he comes to my garden and he's pretty confused because it's looks overrun and full of weeds. But overall, because I know which plants are edible, I can make the most out of my garden while still making sure that it is still productive, but also supports a wider variety of species of myself. Now, I can say it's definitely taken years to learn the right amount to let go, because if you completely let your weeds go out of control, like especially I've learned sometimes what I'll do is I'll let things grow early in the spring, harvest the greens, I'll let them bloom to support pollinators, but then I make sure I go and I pull things before they go to seed, so that we can have a balance, so that I can still support species but I also am not letting things get completely out of control. And that's getting to know the life cycles of individual species in my garden. Mm-hmm.
I got needed things fixed.
Okay. Well, let's go back to our slide just for a second. And so we're going to talk about as we head into the fall. So late summer and fall. So the fall is when all of that energy from the year has consolidated. And we are now into the season of fruits, you know, thinking about all of the beautiful apples and cool summer nights. This is when we're harvesting things from our garden. But from a foraging perspective, this is when we harvest nuts. And then I also think you and I we had a beautiful experience of being able to go harvest wild rice in different situations before. And what I was thinking about when we were talking about forest gardening is that fall is also when we harvest. So I also might be out on the land harvesting seeds and spreading seeds from the plants that I work with. So like that might be actually the time of year you go back to the ramp patch, those wild leek patches, and you like collect some seed from the wild leeks, and maybe you spread, or you go around to other parts of the forest and you pull back some leaves and you spread some of those seeds. It's when I've gone and I'll collect milkweed seeds and and start to carry them to other places around the land. We harvest. I really love working with acorns. It's an example of a plant that, as someone who has a foraging business, I'll never sell acorn flour. The effort and the work that it takes to make acorn flour is like more than I, would be able to charge for. But I love, love, love harvesting acorns. But there's also this act of like when you're harvesting your acorns and you get like like a big, beautiful, perfect, like the really big acorns. I think our Western culture would be like, oh, that's like the best acorn, like that's going to be the best one to eat. But gardeners and farmers and land tenders know that those are actually the ones that you want to put back on the land. That's how we actually cultivate larger acorns for future generations, is by taking the best and planting them. That's why, people who, if you've ever grown garlic before, you will learn that you always take your best, biggest, healthiest garlics, and that's actually what you use to plant. And someone's saying, oh, what do I do with acorns? You can, with many steps, and I do teach those steps in programs that I do, you can make a really delicious, super nutritious flour that you can basically use as the way that we use any other kind of like gluten-free flour. You can basically live off acorns. They're so nutritious. So yes, so fall is when we start to again like collect the roots again, and when you get the frosty nights and the leaves start to die, like we did in the spring, we can harvest roots. We can go back to harvesting roots in the fall because the energy of those plants are going down, and so then you can that's also the time of year. Spring and fall is when we harvest roots, but also that's our land. It's our stewardship time. So we're harvesting from the land, but we're also really thinking about collecting seed, spreading and separating plants, and doing like land tending. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, wonderful. Maybe this might be a good time just to chat. So Laura runs this program called the Wild Medicine Program on the land, and it actually runs May to October. Mm-hmm. And maybe it'd be neat to just kind of share, thinking about in context of now teaching plants in the cycles, like you set it up to work with those seasons, right? And it kind of follows what we're doing right now.
Yeah.
We're talking about.
Yeah. I mean, because I teach classes that are like introductory half-day classes. For many, many years, I was teaching just like a foraging class, and it would be like a day, or maybe it was a weekend. But the part that I felt was really missing was giving people the opportunity to actually come to like one piece of property, follow the plants through the different cycles. We make a number of different like wild foods and like medicine products where it's like you come and you like harvest the plants and we make the tincture, and then you and then you actually like take it home and you have to tend it, and then you bring it back to class and we press it, and we follow things through the cycles, because that's the thing, is it's not something you can learn or teach fully in like a weekend class. Mm-hmm. And it's so land based. Like something for me, like I want people to come and then actually see how does an individual plant shift through the season. I always say my co-teacher, my co-facilitator is like the land is my garden, because every month that people come back to the land and see the different changes, that's so important, because that's how we actually learn, is follow things through, and everything from like the first session in the May, we're like harvesting spring greens and eating things, and it's so delicious. And like the last session, always almost in the October session, we're collecting seeds, and we're like literally collecting seeds of plants that we maybe first were introduced to months ago, so that people can continue that on. Mm-hmm. And so for me, it's always really important to walk people through spring through fall as that foraging time frame. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it's such a beautiful thing to come into those relations with the seasons in that mm-hmm. way. I know some people are asking questions. We will do a little mm-hmm. bit of a Q&A in a few minutes here. And I think you wanted to talk a little bit about kind of tools and equipment a little bit.
Yeah.
Yeah. Maybe why don't we, just because we already brought it up, I'm going to just throw the link up on this. And so for folks that happen, actually, I think we probably have people tuning in from all over the world right now, which mm-hmm. is actually pretty exciting. We've got over 100 people on here mm-hmm. live, which is amazing. And I think I got the thing fixed with the people unmuting themselves. So sorry about the little glitch there, folks. I just had to switch a setting there, and it took me a minute to figure out where it was. So I think we're all sorted there. Mm-hmm. But what I'm going to do is just quickly throw up the link. So we're in Ontario, Canada. We live in the Eastern Woodlands Forest. We're up in the Williams Treaty Land. And we do run in-person programs up here. So if you're super inspired by kind of what we have going on tonight and you happen to live in Ontario or you want to come and visit, I did want to just let you know that there is an opportunity to come and learn from both of us. But mostly Laura in her Wild Muskoka program. She does actually 1-day plant walks, 1-day mushroom walks, and that she does have this more comprehensive wild medicine program that she was just telling you about. And I do appreciate folks just, giving us a chance during this call to let you know about those opportunities to go deeper. And, we love teaching this stuff. We teach it for free on nights like tonight and love sharing the knowledge. But people coming and signing up for the programs, of course, support us in being a small business and doing things like this. So maybe
that's sweet. Looks like, hi, Jennifer. People from who've done wild medicine are actually tuning in tonight. So
beautiful.
I love that.
Oh, nice. Jennifer's waving.
Hi.
Amazing.
Awesome.
So
the last season, we can just pop that up and then probably switch aside. So is winter. So something we can actually switch it because it's winter. One of the things I'll harvest in the winter is I work with the evergreens. So and in some ways it's actually around taking advantage of storm damage. So because especially where we are, lots and lots of snow. So technically you could have been harvesting those root plants all the way through from fall until spring, but it's not really practical. So for winter, my most important kind of like foraging task is actually managing and preparing all of my tools and my processes. So that's the thing that I wanted to actually plant the seed because we're just at that beginning of the foraging season. I was like, man, it's such a good time to remind people that, again, in order to really make the most of the season and also to honor the plants that we're harvesting, we need to be prepared. We need to be prepared with the right tools, the right storage, and the right processing equipment. And so I just wanted to do a little sharing on like what are some of the things that you want to have prepared, like tools and how to prepare your spaces to make the most of the harvest. So for harvesting, you want to have a good selection of good quality tools. So good quality like pruners for if you're going to harvest like the branches or plants that we have like good clean cuts, nice sharp blades. Things that are going to, tend the plants well. And then the beautiful thing is when you're out there, if you have a pair of pruners and maybe you can actually do some tending on some of the wild plants, some of the wild trees. Sometimes when I'm out there harvesting, if I see like a tree that has like a broken branch that's kind of like still hanging on, or like I can actually do some stewardship work while I'm out there with good quality tools. Shovels and garden forks. So if you're harvesting roots, I also use, one of my favorite little tools for harvesting roots I put in the picture, it's called a hori hori. And that is a Japanese gardening tool. I use it in my garden all the time, but I also take it in the forest and I use it for harvesting. So something like, say, wild leeks. I don't harvest many wild leek bulbs. I mostly work with the leaves, but if I am harvesting bulbs, I like to use a small little trowel like this as opposed to a large garden shovel so that my actual impact on the forest floor is more minimal. And then again, making sure you've got like good sharp knives, good sharp scissors, and then clean and sturdy baskets and bags for foraging. I don't know if you can click off for a second.
Yeah.
These are so funny. So my favorite foraging bags in the entire world are IKEA bags. And they're so cheap. Like they're like $2. I found these like rainbow ones. And the rainbow part is practical because I used to use green like bins from like the grocery store, and then you'd be out harvesting, and because the bins were green, I'd like lose them. I'd like forage and I'd fill a bin, and then I would like wander off and get like distracted by like jumping mouse through the forest or something, or like following a bird like I typically do. And so the rainbow foraging bags means that I don't lose them. And they're large and you can wash them. So especially if you're harvesting plants that, maybe have a bit of dirt on them, or things like the milkweed that have like little sap on it. They're like, you can get different sizes of them, but bags are really nice. I have really beautiful handcrafted baskets as well. But I I find that they can get kind of stained and dirty. They're really lovely for like maybe delicate flowers that you're harvesting, but those foraging bag, like those little plastic bags, are some of my favorite ones. So making sure you've got a good selection of things, maybe even just in my backpack, I keep like a few clean Ziploc bags, or paper bags. Now that it's funny, our liquor store stopped giving bags, and I was upset because they were like my favorite good quality paper bags. I love them for foraging and like storing, especially for mushrooms. Like storing mushrooms are really good to do in paper bags. So start collecting and having those tools ready, and even have like a foraging kind of like bin in your car, or like maybe in your like again your backpack that you take hiking. Have a few things in there so that if you're in the right place at the right time, you can also like properly tend those plants by harvesting them with the right tools and having the right stuff. So you can go back to the
go back to the slide. Okay.
So the foraging is always like the exciting part. That's the part people are like, in the forest harvesting the plants. That's like the exciting part. What people don't realize is that I feel like for every like hour that you say spend picking wild plants, you should expect that it's like 3 to 4 times the amount of labor to process it afterwards. So that's why I say storage. Have systems in place. Don't pick things if you don't have room in your fridge, or you don't have like areas to properly store. And wild plants typically, compared to like cultivated, like our cultivated greens, things that you would say buy at the grocery store, all those plants you buy at the grocery store have been bred to have a long shelf life. Wild plants, wild greens, I mean, roots and things like will hold, but especially when we're talking about flowers and mushrooms and greens, they don't last long. And so you need to, if you're going to harvest them, make sure that you can like get them into like good containers in the fridge, or process them right away. Something like roots and things you can sometimes get away, but making sure you're getting them out of the sun as soon as possible. But remember, shelf life is very short, and there's nothing more heartbreaking than like spending all this time and like honor, like you can put down offerings, you can be as grateful, you can put all this gratitude into like harvesting, being so excited, and then if you let it go bad in your fridge, it's just like really heartbreaking and not very honoring to those plants. So before you pick a bunch of stuff, really ask yourself, do I have the space, and do I have time in the next 24 hours to process this plant? And then for processing, making sure you've got like a variety. Like I will wash greens, and then salad spinners are really great for getting the moisture off of them. Making sure that if you're gonna be making like different kinds of like spice mixes, and this is the time of year. So in our with the foraging business right now is when I'm taking the time to restock our salt, getting our oil, getting all our jars cleaned and sorted and organized, making sure like we've got enough space. I'm going through the freezers, I'm clearing out space, we're sorting through everything, and we're getting all of our supplies organized so that when the harvests start, we have everything that we need to make the most of it. And you don't want to be in a place of having harvested these like really beautiful medicinal flowers, let's say, and then get home and be like, oh, I don't have a jar, I don't have any alcohol to make the tincture. A little bit of prep time now, while it's still kind of quiet, can really set yourself up for success. And that's the thing, I really was able to reduce my personal stress load and enjoy the process so much more when I took the time to organize my space, get all my tools together, and make sure that I had the materials and the supplies that I needed to make the most of the harvest in advance.
Yeah. The other one is just like building the calendar throughout the year too. It's been huge for us as well, and when we first started out, you're just kind of excited, you're reading books, and you are kind of just walking into the woods and being like, what is this plant? And oh, what's ready right now? But it's, you go through a bunch of seasons where you're like, oh, I want this. And then all of a sudden it's too late and it's gone. And over time, you start to really understand, like in your habitat, in your region, these are those cycles, which was kind of what we did when we walked around the circle there.
Yeah.
Now we did it with the general things like flowers, roots, nuts. But if you actually now track that to the specific species that you want, so we know like right now it's sap, and then in the spring it goes into the wild leeks and the spring ephemerals, and then, there's blueberries, and there's when we get like our bone set and our yarrow and our mullein and our
And
calendula.
yeah, and it gets to the point like I literally have a 2-week block at the end of July, early August, and it literally says on my calendar, milkweed pickles.
Mhm.
And so it's like if there's certain things that you really love, like that you try a small batch once, you're like, oh my God, I love that so much. I want to really commit to making that. Put it in your calendar, because it's like if I don't put things in my calendar, I won't make time. It's hard to find the time for them.
Yeah, or you miss it, and that happened to
Yeah.
us a whole bunch. Like all of a sudden we would think that, oh, we want to harvest this, and it was too late. We
Yeah.
had that actually with reishi for a number of years when
We
we were
did.
first really doing a lot of
Yeah.
mushrooms. We kept getting excited about reishi, like kind of right at the end of the reishi season, and then they were all kind of punky. And then it was like, you know what? We need to actually just have in our calendar when to start looking for reishi,
Yeah.
and actually make it a little earlier in
Yeah.
the season.
Yeah, you're better to put things in your calendar like before you think you are, because it's like good to scout. Because again, seasonality and climates are changing. The weather is getting more erratic than ever, and so putting notes in your journals and your calendars about checking on things, maybe even like earlier
Mhm.
than you think, because it's always better to go out, take a scout, be like, oh, they're too small or they're not ready yet. Okay, great. Okay, remind myself I'm going to come back in a week. And that preparation is made the world a difference in us actually being able to incorporate this stuff into our life. And it's exactly like when I think about as someone who grew up in like hunting culture, that's what hunting culture. It's like, the time you're going out, hunter, all the good hunters are doing all their prep work months in advance because you want to have success with that harvest. And so we can use, that's a very established model that hunters, role model. And I think with foraging, we can use that same kind of approach of like really being thoughtful and intentional and prepared before the seasons start.
Yeah, absolutely. The other layer I'll say to that, in this era of like quick information through phones and the internet and technology, there is something so beautiful just about coming back into that and like literally just mapping that out throughout the year. Like to sit around in the evening and have a cup of pine tea or pine sap tea and actually just start thinking about like, how are all those cycles flowing? There's something beautiful about coming back into that relationship that I actually think is beyond the actual food, is really good for our minds, our bodies, our souls in this era of technology and busyness, to just re-tap into those seasonal cycles and just know even if you're not getting out to forage them, just to know what's going on with the plants right now and what's going on with the animals and the birds and what animals are eating what's spawning right now, so that's a big part of this as well.
Oh yeah. I mean, on the food thing, like I've really noticed as we've shifted to eating this way, that my body responds by craving things differently at different times. In the fall is when I really like, it's funny, as our garden really winds down and there'll be like all this kale left, I'm often like, oh, I'm like, my body's not craving greens anymore. I want stews, and I'm like, so interested in the meat, and like I get really excited about like baking with the acorns, and because I want like carbs and I want like fat. And then along with the maple sap, like just yesterday, the day before, it was like the first time like I was at the grocery store and I was like, I want this salad mix. And I haven't eaten hardly any salad like all winter. I don't eat a lot of like I've been really craving vegetables, and it was so interesting to catch it in my body and be like, I want greens. And then I realized, I'm like, oh yeah, that's my body telling me that spring is coming, because as soon as those like first greens start coming out, like that's when like I'm like, I want salad all the time. Yeah.
And it's a deep engraved ancient cycle, that we're part of. It's beautiful to come back into that relationship again. So.
And feel it in your body, and like it's really satisfying.
So we're so we're an hour and 5 minutes in. I know some people want some questions. Why don't we take a minute, just share a little bit about your plant and mushroom walks coming up, and then maybe tell folks just a few more details about the wild medicine, and then we can maybe do like 10 minutes of question and answer. How does that sound?
Great.
Do you want the slides, or what do you want to talk about the plant walks first?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I run a variety of programs, but so kind of like a good introductory place for people that are like, just kind of interested is I do half-day foraging programs. And so I have like a spring foraging walk. I do kind of summer stuff. I move them around Muskoka. So quite a number of them are on our homestead. in Lake of Bays, but I also will teach some programs like in Torrance area, just in Bracebridge area. Sometimes I like to be able to showcase different habitats and different species that might not grow on our property. So those are good like introductory programs. So the seasonal ones like the spring foraging, summer foraging, those are really particular to most often focused on plants. And then kind of starting in the late summer through the fall, I run half-day introductory mushroom programs. And those ones, I really start with an in-depth talk about kind of mycology, what makes mushrooms and fungi really different, and then what are the, because often, and two, people are often quite scared about harvesting mushrooms, and so I really make sure we go into the anatomy and the safety of working with mushrooms, and then we just go on a hike and see what we can find. So those half-day programs are like really great for just like really dipping your toes in the water and learning. But we don't really, they're just like introductory. We don't do, because it's just a few hours. It's really just like identification of species, maybe picking like a very small amount, just tasting a few things. But it's just an introduction. If you really want to like go deeper, that's why I have the wild medicine program. So it's one full day. I have a Thursday session for people that weekdays are better, they have more flexibility, and then I have a Saturday session. It's the same curriculum, but it's just to make it accessible to people who work on either weekdays or weekends, or have family commitments and stuff. And that's a full day program. We get together, it's the same people. So what's also really lovely is you get to like come back and be in a group of people and like build those friendships over the course of the program. It's a full day. It's very hands-on experiential. I'm sharing a lot of information, but like I also really want you to like get the experience through working with your hands and also taste. Like I love, like it's like I make all these teas for people there's always some funky tea, and where there's lots of like delicious things that I like to get people to try. We always end it with like a potluck, which is really fun at the end, and people get a chance to like maybe put some of their like foraging experience into practice, or just bring their favorite recipe. We get to like we make things from start to finish. You learn to make tinctures, and you make oils, and we learn how to make like lovely salve, and we go through all of these different medicinal preparations and some like really good foundational information on like understanding like how to start looking at how to use plants for medicine. And it's like in a really like lovely outdoor learning environment and community. And yeah, it's just like, it's my favorite program to run, and I love it.
Yeah. So if anyone's interested in any of those, I did just put the links. There's a link there to the foraging walks. Actually, I think it was Maureen in the chat actually said, hey, I'm in Torrance. I would love to know when you're in Torrance. Yeah. So that's the link there, wildmuskoka.com. There's also a QR code up here right now. So if you're a phone person and you want to actually just scan that QR code with your phone really quick, you could also just pull the website up there. But yeah, wild medicine is starting up this May. The plant foraging walks are starting up in May as well. And if you're in Ontario and would like to come out on the land, we would love to have you up here in Muskoka and connect with you.
Yeah, and we're trying to make the program accessible. I know that things are tight with money and stuff, so I can offer like payment plans and, just to try to help make it accessible for people.
Amazing. So I think we should shift to some question and answers. Maybe just say a word about, we didn't even talk about Wild Muskoka products. Like you got some wild leek vinegar. Why don't you just share some of that stuff really quick? Sure. And then we'll...
just a few of my favorite things that I literally learned from foragers that I learned from. So like this is something called like nettle gamasio. So nettle is this like incredible wild plant. Grows probably, for people that are calling, it's probably one of the most diverse plants in terms of like it's bioregion where it grows. So most people in North America probably have nettle growing near them. And nettle was one of these plants that like someone taught to me, and they're like, oh, it's good for tea. And like, I don't love nettle tea. I think it tastes like spinach. I know people love it. But to me, it tastes like spinach water. And so I was like, I don't really want to drink just nettle tea. What are other ways I can use it? And so one of my foraging teachers had taught me to make nettle gamasio. So it's nettles with toasted sesame and just a little bit of salt. Gamasio is a Japanese word for like a type of spice mixer. And just to say, so it's like sometimes you're like, oh, maybe you learned in a book something's for you could just use it for tea, but maybe you could actually eat it. And spice mixes, making your own spice mixes, are a really great way, kind of like along with those, like when Chris shared about like when we were looking at those cubes. And so it's like easy because it's just in your spice cabinet. It's already ground. Maybe you've seasoned it, spiced, mixed it with other things, and it's easy to just like put on. And so I can have like boxed mac and cheese and put some nettles on it, and all of a sudden I have wild foraged mac and cheese. And then something else like white pine. This is something we harvest the white pine needles in the wintertime, and we actually use a lot of storm damaged trees. And so again, pine is like, if I just sold people bags of pine, they'd be like, I don't know what to do with this. And yes, you can make pine tea. There's lots of things you make tea from. But what's cool, what I found about pine is it has properties really similar. When I was like really looking at the plant, smelling the plant, working with it, I was like, gosh, it's kind of similar to rosemary. It's like really aromatic. It's kind of sticky. I wonder if you could like cook with it like rosemary. And so then I just developed this spice mix where I was like, oh, it's kind of like rosemary. Okay, if they're cousins, I'm going to put them together at the party. And Rosemary's the popular girl that everyone knows. And she's going to introduce pine to all of her friends. So that's why I put them together in the spice mix. And so here's something, it's like pine needles. And now we use it on roasting stuff and all, And so it's just like, again, thinking of like what ways can you prep things in batches and then be able to just like add them to meals really quick. Infused vinegars are really great. So this is like apple cider vinegar, and then we've like steeped the plant matter in it, and you strain it out. And this one of the things we do in wild medicine, we talk about making infused vinegars. And this spruce tips, it's like really lemony. This is such an incredible, almost like alternative to lemon juice that is fully bioregional. It's so much fun. And then we do like bitters. So bitters are an alcohol extract tincture. And especially in the spring, bitters to really kickstart our liver function, after the sluggish winters, in cocktails, in like fun summer drinks. Like, so we take all these like, even things like unusual plants like sarsaparilla root that like I might not know like what to do with from a culinary perspective, but like for flavor, tinctures are made the same way that vanilla extract's made. So I've been playing around with making different kind of like wild bitters, and then in some of my recipes, like substituting vanilla extract for some bitters, just for like also different flavors.
Yeah. Amazing. So folks, I'll just throw the link. Unfortunately, we only ship the products in Canada, just because of all the stuff from tariffs and regulations. But if you're in Canada, I'll throw that down there, wildmuskoka.com for all the products. And let's do a little bit of Q&A. And we had...
we can scan through first.
And somebody had asked about...
recommendations for grinders. So you can kind of go two ways. You can either, like, coffee grinders work great for actually quite a number of like small scale home things, but don't use your coffee grinder that you use for coffee. So always have like a separate one. And some plants can actually be pretty hard on coffee grinders. So literally utilize your Restore. Go to the Restore, find like where they're selling you like $5, 10, like cheap, grinders, and then just utilize old ones. Or, so that's like, the budget ways to just use secondhand ones. I have a grinder that's a company called Preeti. It's from India, and it's a food processor. You can actually do dry grinding and wet grinding. And it's a very powerful motor because it's designed for grinding like Indian spices, like nutmeg. And so that machine is like a workhorse. Like I use it all the time. And the beautiful thing about that machine is that it's designed when you buy it, it has a bag of parts, and they're like, these are the parts that are most likely to wear out. Here, we want this machine to last as long as possible. So we're going to give you the parts to repair what breaks. And I just think that idea around like expecting equipment to be longevity as opposed to this designed obsolescence that's so much more common in the West in terms of like appliances being disposable, I appreciate. Yeah, so it's a company called Preeti. And so I've been using it for years, wet grinding and dry grinding. And they're more affordable than like a Vitamix. Like is also a very powerful motor, but they're quite expensive. So I like to give people options.
Do you dehydrate the pine needles?
I do. Yeah. So we actually they will air dry. They take a longer time, but pine will dry. Like if you have like big baskets like this, or even just like shallow cardboard boxes in a place with like good airflow, or drying racks, pine will dry in the air pretty good, especially in the winter time. Like we harvest a lot in the winter just because you get storm damaged trees, and then we can utilize the like the broken branches. And so our house humidity is typically lower in the winter, so it's easier to dry.
Amazing. Is the best way, this is kind of what you just said, but the best way to dry wild plants, hanging them in a bundle or hanging on a rack?
I prefer on racks if possible, because in a bundle you might have a section where you have like leaves that are kind of like squished up against each other and you don't have air. You want airflow around the plant. If there's a certain, like there's the odd time where like for space, it's nice to hang things. So if I have a plant where I can harvest the whole plant, so the plant that's coming to my mind right now, I'm thinking of red raspberry. So red raspberry, we harvest wild raspberries for their fruit, but the leaves are actually really, really good tea. And they're actually really, really good like women's tea. And that's a plant that I'll harvest like the whole cane. And then I could hang like off one leaf, I might be able to hang like the whole stem of the plant. And then but I don't like to bundle plants and tie them up and then hang them, because I find that you might not get airspace around where they've been bundled. If I can take them off their leaves and hang them on like flat racks, it's definitely my preference. Really, the conditions that you want for drying plants are good airflow, low humidity, and dark. And so however you have to try to like MacGyver your spaces that's what you want to think about. It's like they want good airflow in the dark, and so and lower humidity. So just rejig your spaces or figure out what you have just to create that.
Yeah. Few people in there are asking about programs for kids. I'm going to just throw the link up there. So we don't run kid-specific programs. If you have a mature child though, and they want to come along with you, like we will sometimes allow them on a plant walk, as long as they're mature and understand that it's kind of geared towards adults. And if they're genuinely interested, we're definitely open. Even some of the longer programs, if you have a mature child that or youth that you think is genuinely interested, best chance would be to actually just reach out, send us an email, and we can chat whether it's appropriate.
Last year in my One Mushroom program, that was like a multi-part program, like a mom and her 15-year-old son came because he was really excited about mushrooms, and they came together.
Yeah, that was like the multi-part program. He came multiple weeks and he really loved it. So yeah. I just threw the link in there again, folks, if folks are interested in the plant walks. And then I think this is maybe the last one here.
I saw someone. Beer flats. Beer flats are great because then you can stack them on the angles and you got that airflow around them.
Totally. My question is inspired by the fact that I'm sick right now. What's your number one go-to wild medicine for colds, respiratory infections, sinus?
Yeah. So thinking about once you're really sick, and maybe we'll give an example. So in wild medicine, I often will go through like a whole talk about like understanding what we call energetics, which is like, so for example, a cough. There's so many different herbs that if you looked up like herbs for a cough, you would find like 100 herbs. And so when we're learning about what we call herbal energetics, it's actually not just what herb is good for the cough, but we'll ask what kind of cough is it? What's the energetic of a cough? Is it a really like wet cough that's really sluggish in the lungs? Because that might be a totally different herb than a cough that's really like dry and hacking. And so we want to actually have different actions. So I'll give an example without knowing anything about your condition. We'll say if it's a really like, ooh, my lungs are like really heavy, really thick. Like I can feel that there's like mucus filling in my lungs. You don't want it to transition to something like bronchitis or pneumonia. That's where mullein leaf, as tea or as like actual steam inhalations can be like a really, really good one for that. So that particular type of cough where is if it's like a really dry hacking cough that's lingering after you've been sick for a long time. That might be an example where I would use a plant called elecampane. If it's like a really gross sinus infection where you've got all this mucus in your nose, I might actually use a plantain, you know, like the common plantain that grows in the lawns. I might use that for teas. I might also do like sinus flushes, like what's called like a neti pot with a little bit of salt in that tea, and actually use the plantain to like draw out the infection. Yeah. But yeah, so it's sometimes it's not as easy of an answer as like what herb is good for what. It's actually around learning the energetics of the plant and then the body.
Yeah. And it's part of why, you know, herbal medicine is not something you go and just learn in a day, you know, and it's why we really like the longer term programs where the students come back over and over again and we can actually go on that deeper journey and really kind of dive into some of these intricacies. So it looks like the questions are slowing down. I think we're going to call it a night, and it looks like we've got, seems like folks are enjoying themselves. Thank you so much for coming to join us on a Wednesday evening. You get a little tour of our Wild Muskoka. This is actually the production kitchen here where Laura makes all her fun wild forage goodies. Yep. And I don't know, you got any closing comments for folks before we say goodnight?
Thanks so much for just coming and spending some time with us. And it's so nice to see some familiar faces, and wishing you all a really lovely spring.
If you get a chance, if you can do one thing, go tap a maple tree and drink some sap. Yeah. It's so good for your body this time of year. If you got one takeaway, and a pretty easy one to do, a pretty fun one. So, all right. Good night, everybody.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks so much for joining us.